If I want to transfer value to you, I can use any system from kind of Hawala through to crypto and everything in between. If I'm a central bank governor and I want to store value, I'm probably not going to want to store the national wealth of my country in crypto. I'm going to want to store that in an asset that I know is going to retain its value. And you have to look a long, long way past the US dollar and the euro and basically the kind of the dominant Western currencies to find an alternative. In fact, you won't find an alternative.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of Public Key. We have new hosts, a new look, and new amazing guests to discuss crypto and blockchain, policy and financial crime, tech, and everything in between. I'm today's host, Eitan Danon, Content Marketing Manager at Chainalysis. Russia's invasion of Ukraine, tensions in the Middle East, the incoming administration in the US, and BRICS exploration of projects outside the US dollar have all compounded into what might be a historic year of alternative payment systems and geopolitics. In this episode, I sit down with Tom Keating, the director of the Center for Finance and Security at RUSI, to discuss the intersection of digital assets and geopolitics. Tom shares his journey into crypto, highlighting a 2011 Bitcoin meetup with crypto OGs, and explains RUSI's history and focus on financial crime and state-based threats, emphasizing the role of alternative payment systems in geopolitical competition, particularly in the context of sanctions evasion, as well as the weaponization of SWIFT, the development of CBDCs, and the potential impact of the incoming administration on international relations, financially and writ large. Before we jump into this episode, I want to share some exciting news at Chainalysis. At the end of 2024, we announced that we had acquired Hexagate, the leading provider of Web3 security solutions that detect and mitigate real-time threats, including cyber exploits, hacks, and governance and financial risks. Together, Chainalysis and Hexagate will provide a holistic risk solution that includes prevention, compliance, and remediation. Now, on to our episode. Today, I'll be speaking with Tom Keating, the director of the Center for Finance and Security at the Royal United Services Institute in London.
Thanks for having me.
Great to have you. So, Tom, you spent almost 20 years at JP Morgan, with the last 2 years of that as the managing director. I believe was the head of the European Public Sector Group. It would be great to learn about your journey towards crypto or alternative payment systems in general. I believe in one of your own podcasts, this is very meta, podcast interviewing a podcaster, you mentioned having gone to a Bitcoin meetup early on in West London in 2012 or something of the sort. So it would be great to learn about your own journey and how you made it to this topic.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think the cryptoverse would view me as something of a dinosaur because I grew up on trading floor at JP Morgan and everything we did was very traditional, of course, back then. And indeed, I think one of the very vocal critics of crypto in the early days was Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan, who, frankly, I think the guy walks on water, so I'm more than happy to follow what he has to say. But anyway, JP Morgan had a very generous sabbatical policy, which meant that in 2011, I took a year out to study at King's College London. I studied intelligence and international security, and there was a very inspirational lecturer we had back then, a guy called Dr. Thomas Ridd, who I think now works in Washington, D.C., but he put all sorts of ideas in my mind about sort of the cyber world and, I don't know, signing up for DDoS attacks and this kind of stuff. And there was a bit of a conversation about crypto. This is 2011, you've got to remember. Anyway, I saw something online about a meetup that was going to happen in Paddington, in a bar or a pub in Paddington, and to discuss crypto. And I thought, well, why not? I'm a student. My mind is open. And so I went along to this. And this is where I first really started to understand about crypto. And these were the OG crypto bros in London. These were not 20-somethings. These were guys in their like 60s and 70s who had sort of come across this topic and thought it was intellectually fascinating. And by the way, if you want to buy Bitcoin for $11 a pop, then why not have a go and learn how it all works? So that's kind of how I first came across the whole concept of crypto, just kind of, I suppose, academic curiosity in a pub in Paddington in West London.
So for our listeners, I think they're not familiar. I'm personally familiar, but what is RUSI? What is the organization's mandate? And it would be great for our listeners to learn a little bit more about the CFS, as in my estimation, there are few organizations, if any, that are really like it.
Well, it's very kind of you to say. So RUSI is a near 200-year-old defense and security think tank. So listeners in the United States will be scratching their heads and wondering what was going on in the UK or in Europe nearly 200 years ago. And the simple answer is that RUSI was founded by the Duke of Wellington. And the Duke of Wellington, if you know anything about European history, was a British military character who decided to defeat the French at all forms of military combat. So in those days, on the sea and on land, famously at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. And for various reasons, a few years after that happened in 1831, he energized the creation of RUSI. And I suppose the short version is it was a place where people who had this kind of military experience were encouraged to go to study it and write it down and basically memorialize the tactics that had allowed the British to defeat the French. Anyway, fast forward to 2014, and I had just left JP Morgan, and there was a conference going on at RUSI which was about financial crime, and I went to that conference. I was, as I say, an unemployed investment banker with really far too much time on his hands, and I said to someone at lunch, you guys should think about maybe setting up a research program based on the financial crime topic, which was the topic of the conference. And the chap said, well, yes, actually we are thinking of doing that, and I'm the person thinking of doing that, and what are you doing tomorrow? To which I said nothing. He said, right, well, why don't you come in and let's start writing a business plan? So that's how the journey of my program started in 2014. And essentially we style ourselves as studying matters at the intersection of finance and security. So we apply financial lens to global security issues. And in this day and age, there are a great many global security issues, and actually understanding the financial dimension of them, we would argue, is very valuable. So that's how we earn our corn.
That's great. Thank you for a little bit of history. I think a quick look on the RUSI website suggests that there's not as much attention being paid to the potential for war with France, but certainly with the international system currently in flux, it would be great for you to walk us through some of your research on alternative payment systems, why you think they're developing, what are some examples, and how you see crypto fitting in. I think because we're Chainalysis, we have a tendency to focus on the crypto nexus to everything. I think it would be great for our listeners to get some of the strategic context from you.
Yes, I mean, just as we think that there's a financial solution to every security problem, I'm quite sure at Chainalysis you think that there's there's a crypto issue under every rock and around every corner, which
is there not?
We can have that debate as we go along. So I suppose where we start is from a macro level. So we're a policy-led research program. We don't do investigations, but what we do look at is how are the various tools that are out there, and that could be cash, that could be banks, it could be crypto. How are those tools used by malign actors, be they organized crime groups or terrorist organizations or indeed states? And one feature of our work over the last 5 years is just how much the state-based element of our work has increased. So yes, of course, there's still terrorist organizations out there like Hamas and Hezbollah, which use all these different tools to fund and resource their activities. There are organized crime groups still trying to process the cash sale of their drugs and launder all of that and so on. But there's more and more state-based activity. And this is where I think the alternative payments issue is of particular interest, because of course, when states compete, one of the things that is in play is the global payment system. And what's quite interesting is that during the Cold War, the global payment system was a relatively neutral space. It was sort of, SWIFT was the Switzerland of the financial system, if you like. Whereas now, in the last few years, people are walking down the streets demonstrating against Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine with banners saying, de-SWIFT Russia now. I think they've got no idea what that means, but it was sort of a notion that caught on. So this idea that the international payment system and the sort of global settlement system has become part and extension of the global security architecture means that countries that are adversaries to those that dominate the Western payment system, i.e. United States and Europe, are looking for new ways of efficiently conducting international payments, continuing trade beyond, bluntly, the reach of Uncle Sam and its sanctions regime. For me, it's important to understand this underlying plumbing, because if you don't understand it, then actually you don't understand what is an emerging dimension of international great power competition.
Excellent. So the global payments architecture itself is an object of, if not war in the future, at least of strategic competition between East, West, and otherwise, one could say.
Without doubt, and not to dwell on the whole SWIFT question, but as I say, SWIFT has become sort of a consideration when countries are thinking about payment messaging. And for those that aren't steeped in the lexicon of international payments, SWIFT is not how money moves around the world, it's how banks tell each other to debit and credit accounts, and therefore, ergo, create the movement of money around the world. But we now understand, and we see that countries like China and Russia are setting up their own payment messaging systems because they've realized that actually SWIFT is potentially a threat, or being connected to SWIFT is a threat. And indeed, SWIFT is a giant intelligence database, right? You can see everything that every bank on the planet pretty much is doing. So who's sticking their beaky nose in there? After 9/11, the United States created something called the Terrorist Finance Tracking Program, which was a very tightly controlled but nonetheless entree into SWIFT data in the context of concerns about certain terrorist activities. So, SWIFT has been weaponized, and so therefore, if you're on the other side of that trade, you are going to try and develop your own systems, and that's what China and Russia have done, and now the United States and others are thinking about how to respond to that. That's just one example of how the payment system has become a forum for international, as I said before, great power competition.
Thank you. That's, I think, will be an extremely useful background to our listeners. So especially since, I want to pick up on something relating to Russia, especially since February 2022, RUSI has devoted considerable attention to shining a light on sanctions evasion and analyzing the effectiveness of their implementation. Our crypto crime report is coming out in the winter. We'll have a section on sanctions, and in September, we put out a blog piece analyzing new legislation in Russia. I think the Russian finance ministry and central bank have been a bit ambivalent historically. There seems to be something of an about face afoot to legitimize the use of crypto for mining and in some international payments context, which I think ties into some of what you were describing now. My question for you is, how do you see sanctions fitting into this conversation around alternative payments?
Yeah, so when the full-scale invasion began, I suppose everyone was focused on what are the oligarchs going to do, because they were having their assets frozen and the like. And I think for kind of individual payment flows or payment flows that an individual might make, crypto certainly has a role to play in sanctions circumvention. And as you rightly point out, Russia has done a full 180 on its attitude towards crypto. I remember I got the chance to go to a FATF regional typologies meeting. That sounds like a whole load of jargon, but basically it was a bunch of people getting together from Southeast Asia and Eurasia to talk about financial crime typologies in a giant warehouse in Novosibirsk in December.
A different kind of warehouse party.
Yeah, a different kind of warehouse party. And indeed, I have to say, one of the joys of my life was seeing the delegation from Vietnam and Cambodia experiencing snow for the first time when they arrived in Novosibirsk. But anyway, the point is that in that conversation, there was a specific track talking about crypto. And to summarize it, the Russian delegation was saying very simply, we are going to outlaw the use of crypto. And I was asked for my view on this, and I said, I've just got two words for you, good and luck, because you're not going to achieve that. So now, yes, we see the central bank governor and others introducing legislation to facilitate the use of crypto for cross-border payments. But I think, to my mind, that's the kind of the kernel of a bigger issue when it comes to the question of sanctions circumvention, because we're seeing, for example, coins like Tether being talked about much, much more. We're seeing discussions about payment systems being co-opted, perhaps that were developed for other things in the past, like the Asian Clearing Union, now being considered as a potential platform for clearing of payments to avoid the use of the US dollar. So fundamentally, what are we talking about here? We're talking about finding anything that allows people to trade with each other that is not the US dollar and does not pass through the Western banking system.
Thank you. Yeah, I think on your point towards a total ban, we at Chainalysis tend to think that the fastest way to increase adoption in mainstream digital assets is to ban it. I mean, we've seen a number of different jurisdictions where that's happened, and you can't really keep technology out of people's mobile phones and heads for too long. So picking up on that point a little, I think many have argued recently that combating sanctions circumvention and these efforts to remake the international financial system, if not in the image of China and Russia, then at least to kind of change them dramatically to their advantage, is going to involve enlisting the support of critical middle powers. We saw at the BRICS summit in Kazan in October, I believe, Russia was anything but isolated. It enjoyed the participation of Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, other powers. It would be great to get your thoughts on the impact or effectiveness some of these channels are having. Certainly in the US, with the incoming administration, there's been a lot of takes, both hot and measured, on the BRICS as an entity, its bank, and the prospects for de-dollarization, or at least perhaps eroding the role of the dollar as the main reserve asset right now.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of loose talk on this topic, and I think you have to get a bit geeky and divide the payments world into the sort of different elements of it. If I want to transfer value to you, then, I can frankly use anything to transfer value to you. I can use any system from kind of Hawala through to crypto and everything in between. If I want to store value, if I'm a central bank governor and I want to store value, well, I'm probably not going to want to store the national wealth of my country in crypto or in beans or in anything having orange juice, right? I'm going to want to store that in an asset that I know is going to retain its value, is going to remain convertible, is going to be liquid when I need to liquidate it, etc., etc., etc. And you have to look a long, long way past the US dollar and the euro and basically the kind of the dominant Western currencies to find an alternative. In fact, you won't find an alternative. And so I think what we have at the moment is a kind of a discussion which is sort of slightly being conflated, which is, you know what, Iran wants to trade with India and it wants to do that without using the US dollar. Well, okay, that's fine. If you want to buy Iranian oil, and you're India, and you, Iran, are cool with being paid in Indian rupees, then go ahead, make that trade. But now Iran has a whole load of Indian rupees, and it basically can only use those Indian rupees for buying stuff from India. So unlike the US dollar, which is kind of universally accepted. So I think a lot of the chest beating, and by the way, I'm not naive, but I think a lot of the chest beating on de-dollarization and, you know, we're going to set up our own systems and so on, maybe they will set up payment systems, but ultimately you would not be doing your country a service as a central bank governor if you decided to get rid of all the US dollars in your reserve portfolio. Just allow me, some people have heard me tell this story before, but in my last year at JP Morgan, because my clients, so I worked in a team whose clients were central banks in the Europe, Middle East and Africa, there was a mission at JPM to try and boost the offshore purchase of Chinese RMB assets, right? So let me unpack that. Basically, what we wanted to do was to go to highly rated entities like the European Investment Bank and say, hey, will you issue AAA rated, so top credit rated assets denominated in Chinese RMB to sort of develop a new asset class? And the people that were likely to buy those assets when they were issued in the bond markets, hopefully underwritten by JP Morgan, that was the idea, would be central banks. And in order to do that, central banks would have to sell something to create the cash in order to buy those RMB denominated assets. And so we spent the year going around to people and saying, hey, sell some US dollar assets and buy Chinese RMB instead. And at the end of the year, we had successfully got people to sell US dollar assets from their reserve portfolio, but they bought more Swedish krona denominated bonds than they had Chinese RMB. Now, this is 2013, 2014, so it's quite some time ago. But
still
the point
telling.
it is, exactly, because do you trust the Chinese RMB? Do you really want your national wealth to be in a currency like that? I think this movie's got a lot further to go, but I think we would be naive if we felt that initiatives like alternative payment systems that were being discussed in Kazan at the BRICS summit are not a potential reality and something that we need to track closely.
Absolutely. And thank you for unpacking that in such detail. I think for our listeners, thinking about things in terms of where the value sits, storage and transfer, you know, for those who come from a communications background, where the communication sits versus when it's in transit and points of vulnerability would be useful. So I want to move a little bit to, and you yourself as the host of Suspicious Transaction Report podcast, you had Andrea Kendall-Taylor from CNAS on, and we're seeing a lot of literature and a lot of policy attention right now being paid to, you know, on the CNAS side, they call it the axis of upheaval. Others have called it the axis of evasion. What are your thoughts on some of the financial collaboration within said axis, whether we think this is a cohesive blocking or not? I mean, one thing that jumps out immediately is Iran and Russia linking their payment systems. What impact do you think this will really have? And what are some of the challenges, at least in the West, for those trying to combat this grouping?
These are marriages of convenience, I think. I mean, I like Andrea's terminology of axis of upheaval, because at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is they're railing against the kind of Western imposed order. And by the way, they're not alone, right? I mean, there are plenty of countries in the global south that feel that the kind of my way or the highway of Europe or the US is frankly not appropriate in the modern day. So, you know, that's a conversation for another time. I suppose I come back to my fundamental premise, which is that on the discussion that I had with Andrea on our podcast, I think kind of where we ended up on that discussion, if memory serves, is ultimately we need to keep working hard to ensure that we in the West are offering an alternative that is sufficiently attractive to encourage people to lean our way. We can't expect countries, I don't think, to sign up 100% to, you know, come hell or high water, we are going to march shoulder to shoulder with the UK, the EU and the US. But at the same time, we want them to commit to the norms and standards that we aspire to promote. And I think we frankly need to be smarter in the way that we do that. And I think looking at the Russia sanctions and the response of what the EU calls third countries to Russia sanctions is instructive, because diplomats have spent a lot of time circling the globe, visiting countries like the UAE and Turkey and places in Central Asia, and essentially saying, look, we want you to get on board with the Russia sanctions regime issued by the United States, by the EU, by the UK and others from the G7. What I don't think we've been good at doing, though, is saying, and here's a carrot. Here's a reason that you should do that. And of course, we would hope that the reason that Russia has illegally invaded an innocent neighbor should be sufficient for them to sign up. But at the end of the day, countries are going to consider their own national interest. So what are you offering me? I don't know, Georgia is kind of a bad example at the moment. But what are you offering me, a country in the South Caucasus or Central Asia, that I get in return for putting myself in harm's way? Like, I'm another country that neighbors Russia, and you're asking me to restrict the purchase of oil, or you're asking me to restrict the flow of critical high priority sort of technologies needed by the Russian military. So I think we need to work harder at offering something in return and not simply kind of railing against what they are doing because we don't like it. So I think that's a kind of really important sort of other side of this. But of course, we still have the power of the US dollar, the extraordinary privilege of the US dollar, as Valéry Giscard d'Estaing said. We still have that in our corner, but I don't think we should be using that. If you think every problem is a nail, you always use a hammer or something like that. From an academic perspective, the approach that the President-elect Trump is taking with sort of threatening sanctions left and right to do all sorts of things, stop immigration, stop people developing financial systems that reject the mighty US dollar. Who knows what he'll use tariffs for next, but it's not going to be for economic purposes. I could pretty much guarantee it.
So trade wars are not easy to win.
No, trade wars aren't easy to win. And I think as we all know, who ends up paying the tariffs? It's the American people. So I think we need to work harder to justify why people should stay within the financial system that we've created and why they shouldn't be afraid of it unless they're planning on invading an innocent neighbor.
As someone who previously worked at the U.S. Department of the Treasury and comes out of its national security apparatus, your words resonate deeply with me. I think for our listeners who are interested in this, I would recommend Saleha Mohsen's book, Paper Soldiers, on the weaponization of the U.S. dollar in recent decades. I don't endorse every point in it, but it's a great read, and I think will get people's wheels turning on these topics. So on this set of marriages of convenience or groupings that are trying to erode the status quo, from your vantage point, from RUSI's perspective, how do crypto and digital assets, permissionless and permissioned, fit into this conversation? And any student of history would know that these are not natural alliances, or not alliance, perhaps might not be the right word, but there's a lot of historical friction between some of these countries. And so I guess my question is, what are some of those carrots that you propose or mention?
Sorry to be boring, but the first carrot is respect, right?
Undervalued in our day and age.
Yeah, exactly. So the kind of my way or the highway attitude, I don't think necessarily endears countries around the world to us, and we need to respect that. Again, just using the kind of Russia case as a focus, what the Western allies failed to do after February 2022 is basically make the case and to win the strategic communications battle with Russia. The likes of Sergei Lavrov had done multiple laps of Africa, blaming energy price shocks and food security issues on Western sanctions before we had realized that was happening and had got our act together to try and combat that messaging. And so we're kind of on the back foot. I'm going to dangerously swerve into American sports analogies here. I don't think we've quite reached the moment where we need to throw a Hail Mary, but we definitely need to work harder at basically selling why our half of the globe is the half that you want to be part of. For so long as there are the alternative payment mechanisms, whether it's crypto, whether it's groups of countries getting together around a common central bank digital currency, for example, as those alternatives develop, and they're only going to develop, right? There's no going back, or whatever one might think of crypto or anything else, there's no going back, frankly, as the Russians discovered themselves. We need to work harder to explain why actually, you don't need to run your economy on Bitcoin. You're perfectly safe running it on the US dollar, or being connected to the US dollar, or using the international correspondent banks based in New York and London. And as the appeal of crypto, or as the ubiquity of central bank digital currency technology develops, we're going to have to work even harder, because the options will proliferate. Using the US dollar or using the euro or pound sterling becomes less and less obvious a need.
Very fascinating. You mentioned CBDCs at the end. Is that the area where you think there's the most compelling argument on the side of China, Russia, and others to move away from the dollar? Or is it more of the stablecoin, Bitcoin, permissionless crypto technology? Is it something else? Where do you see digital assets in this conversation?
I mean, I think it's going to be a combo because right now, no one digital asset alternative has, I think, the capacity or the network to provide the kind of the volume. I mean, just imagine trying to run, whatever it is, $1-2 trillion economy like Russia using Bitcoin as your method of payment. I mean, it's just not going to work, right? So
there isn't the liquidity there, either,
exactly,
or the network, right, or the network capacity. Yeah.
Exactly. So you're going to need a kind of a combo of these different tools available to you. So you're basically going to have to cobble together an alternative to the ubiquity and the liquidity and the accessibility of the US dollar. But as the years and maybe even just the weeks go past, the opportunities of using these alternatives, these digital tools, digital currencies, expands. So, China might set up, digital currency rails that connect it with its kind of regular trading partners, for example. And so, all the settlement will be easily done in ECNY. Yeah, exactly. I just think that it's going to be a mosaic, but I think over time, the pieces of the mosaic will get bigger and bigger and bigger until, maybe there are half a dozen tools you need to act as an alternative to the US dollar rather than probably the, 25, 30, 40, 50 you need today. And again, sorry to be boring, but I would stress this point that there is a fundamental difference between setting up payment rails where value moves from A to B and setting up stores of value where you are basically stewarding the national wealth. And those two things are very different. The former is much easier to do as an alternative to the US dollar than the latter, in my opinion.
Yes, custody and storage versus transfer. And I think for the naysayers, at least in the U.S., who invoke Mark Twain, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. A lot of this is a long-term game, and we're talking about the fate of the international system itself. So this gets into mainstreaming things that perhaps over 10 or 15 years become more normalized. It's not a short-term horizon by any stretch.
Yeah, and the reality is that for the next 4 years in the United States, we can kind of expect the winds to be at the back of the kind of the crypto community on the one hand. So there'll be lots of opportunities, there'll be lots more innovation coming, I'm sure, and there'll be lots of things that we haven't even thought of today that will be around 3 or 4 years from now, because people will feel that they've got the confidence to invest in developing that technology. And at the same time, there may also be a wind that encourages people to move away from using the US dollar more and more, which will be the heavy use of sanctions or the heavy use of tariffs by an incoming President Trump. I mean, I would encourage people to read. I've been going back and looking at some of the Donald Trump speeches when he was president last time around, and there's a speech he made in the Oval Office, I think it was, when he was signing into law CATSA, the Combating Americans' Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, I think is what it stands for.
Yes.
The short version of that, and I suspect maybe you were in Treasury at the time, I don't know, but the short version of that is that took some sanctioning power away from the White House and vested it in Congress. I think that's my rough summary. And it would pass Congress with no trouble at all. And when he signed that into law, he had a big grumble about the fact that sanctions were a tool for doing great deals to the American people. And by shifting some of the power from the White House to Congress, that tool was being removed in part from the hands of the president. And then he says at the end something like, and who's better at doing deals for the American people, Congress or a billionaire successful businessman like Donald Trump? Slam down, end of speech. So personally, from an academic perspective, I'm quite excited about the Trump presidency because I think we're going to see a lot of stuff going on.
That's a very safe bet.
Yeah, having this conversation again in 4 years' time, I think we could be looking at a landscape which has changed quite considerably.
Absolutely. A few quick points. I think your CATSA summary was spot on, as was your football analogy, your American football. I would never call American football to an Englishman. Thank you for that. I think there's certainly no shortage of threat actors right now. And if you go on RUSI's website or follow some of Chainalysis's research, between nation states, traditional organized crime networks, and others who are abusing the international financial system or at least trying to bend it to their advantage. We have the invasion of Ukraine, tensions in the Taiwan Strait. The Middle East, yet again, is literally on fire. My question for you, Tom, is what keeps you up at night?
Well, I live in a national park in the UK, so what keeps me up at night is the owls hooting
the
outside.
Nightingales.
Yeah, exactly. If I think about the projects that we run at RUSI in my program, first of all, the number of projects is expanding. So there's clearly, great interest in trying to understand the financial dimension of the growing number of of threats that we witness. But I think probably what keeps me up at night is that fundamental institutions that we've relied on for decades, like the UN, like the Financial Action Task Force, and everything in between, are finding it more and more difficult to hold themselves together and thus maintain a sort of a global standard of responsibility. So if I just look at things through my own little lens, the fact that SWIFT is now sort of open season on SWIFT, I find that problematic. I find it problematic that we are having conversations about the payment system and the financial system being weaponized and fragmenting. It's just not good for global coherence. And the thing that really keeps me up at night is I have a book in my study which was written in, I think, 1933, 34. And basically it's a study of the economic tools used against Germany during the First World War. And when you read that book and you realize it was written basically 100 years ago, there are some scary parallels in that book with where we are now. And of course, we all know what happened after 1933, 34, right? So that probably is what keeps you up at night. It's flicking through that book and wondering whether past is prologue, as they say.
I mean, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I think for the pessimists among us looking at what you just described, I think many might wonder whether we're witnessing in slow motion the fragmentation of the international system. There was just a piece over the weekend in the Wall Street Journal about whether we're in World War III right now and don't even know it or are realizing it too slowly. I guess a final question as a continuation of what you were just describing. Going back to RUSI and your focus for the CFS and the Institute writ large, one of the things I think that really sets your team apart is the strategic angle to the focus on financial crime and economic statecraft. It would be great for our listeners to learn a little bit about what's on your roadmap for the first half of 2025.
Sure. So there are basically two halves to what we do. We have part of our program focuses on what we call financial crime policy. So that's sort of the blocking and tackling of anti-money laundering legislation, beneficial ownership registries, how do we improve access to information there, and all the sort of stuff related to the Financial Action Task Force. There are some interesting things going on there around developments in the EU and elsewhere. So that'll be quite active. And then on the sort of state-based threat side, sanctions, economic security, and related issues, I think for us there, and thinking about it from a European perspective, I'm astonished that Europe has managed to stay active on sanctions against Russia for as long as it has done. I mean, if you think about after 2014, the Europeans and others kind of issued sanctions and then kind of went home and thought, well, we've done everything we can do.
We do need our gas, after all.
Yeah, we do. Yes, we do need our gas. Well, so I think 2025, with the arrival of Donald Trump and everything else, I think on the kind of Russia sanction side could be extremely interesting. And Europe is going to have to assume that many of the allies that were in US Treasury, kind of assistant secretaries and undersecretaries who, we've stood shoulder to shoulder across the Atlantic on sanctions against Russia over the last 3 years, that isn't there anymore. Europe is going to have to, and I say Europe as opposed to the EU, because I mean the EU and the UK together.
And the UK.
Is going to have to really get its stuff together to operate potentially in an autonomous fashion. And then I think the other thing that we are investing a lot of time and effort in is this focus that countries are placing increasingly on economic security. So again, supply chain integrity is no longer guaranteed. The United States has been way out in front on recognizing that and acting on that compared to the Europeans. We run a task force on the European economic security from my team at RUSI, and the EU, the UK, and others, again, need to get their acts together because the world is not becoming safer, and the decisions that were made by countries like Germany to kind of cozy up to Russia back in the day turned out to be very much the wrong decision, and frankly, not distancing ourselves and our critical supply chains from China and kind of other potentially hostile actors will come back to bite us, unfortunately. So I think that's probably the kind of state-based dimension of what we do, I think will continue to grow considerably. And then the last point I'd mention, which is that we just learned today that we've been awarded a new grant to work on terrorist financing. And terrorist financing has not been a thing for the last 2 or 3 years, at least in the research world. So that seems to be back as a topic that people want to focus on. And obviously we will certainly embrace that.
That's great. Thank you for the overview. I think one thing that's clear is that given the way the world looks today, there will be no shortage of work on your side nor on ours. And thank you for your time today. This has been a very illuminating discussion, and it's been great to have this discussion with you.
For sure. Thanks to you, Eitan, and thanks to Chainalysis for having me.
Wow, this was such an interesting conversation, and Tom's examples relating to Iranian oil are even more relevant, because on December 19th, 2024, the U.S. Department of the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned 12 individuals and entities across various jurisdictions for arms trafficking, money laundering, and illicit shipment of Iranian oil on behalf of Houthi rebels. Further, OFAC updated the sanctions designation of Saeed al-Jamal, a key Iran-based financier for the Houthis and Iran's IRGC Quds Force, to include 5 cryptocurrency addresses belonging to him. For more insights about the Houthis and Saeed al-Jamal, what their on-chain transactions look like, and why their disruption is important, head down to the show notes and click on our blog for more graphs and details.